Michael Jackson was a big fan of Spider-Man. The actor was so imbued with this character that at one point he wanted to play him in a movie. And in the 1990s, the king of pop turned to the author with a proposal to buy the rights of a film adaptation of this character. Then, the author said it was impossible to do this with his help. You have to go to the publisher itself. And then Jackson decided to buy not just the film, but the entire company. Unfortunately, nothing came out of the venture. What a pity. After all, now it's one of the most successful film studios in the world. In the last 10 years alone, it has made over $17 billion. This is Marvel Studios. In this video, you'll learn why Marvel has been proving in court that its superheroes are not human. And in the movies, they do the opposite? How did a child psychologist with his book nearly destroy the comic book industry? And finally, why doesn't the author of these movie characters own the company? Marvel Story. So, Stanley Martin Lieber, the man who was once blamed for his mediocrity, the one who embodies characters in comics without a hint of Mary Sue. If anything, Mary Sues are unfinished characters without any flaws, plastic and perfect. Stanley was born on December 28, 1922 in Manhattan. His parents were Jewish immigrants of Romanian descent. His father, Jack Lieber, worked as an ordinary dressmaker. Celia, his mother, worked as a retail salesman. With the help of relatives, they even managed to get an apartment in Manhattan, but they could barely make ends meet. Then came the Great Depression. The father had no job at all. Eventually, the family had to move to the Bronx. Relationships became strained. Mother and father drifted apart. The reason for this were issues about money. Stanley recalled with sadness and kind of a sad irony about those times. Quote, "My father was not a good businessman. For the most part, he didn't have a job. I felt sorry for him." Poverty was the first thing that affected Stanley and his character. He learned to work to survive. In addition, he was a very bookish man, read everything he could get his hands on, and dreamed of being a great novelist like Mark Twain. He wasn't a novelist, but he was a great one. In the end, his strong character and hobbies allowed him to work almost everywhere, from a newspaper delivery man and, let's say, a one-time journalist to an assistant in some companies. And all this he managed to combine with his studies, which he completed at the age of 16. He gave up on further education. His desire was to make a career. Fortunately for him, he had a cousin named Martin Goodman, who owned a company called Timely. He was able to get a job as an assistant at that company. He did the simplest jobs: fetching coffee and sandwiches, sweeping the floors, proofreading articles, editing drawings. His salary was $8 a week. A year went by and his brother started asking for opinions about the stories Timely was publishing. He even began to inquire about ideas Stanley would like to bring to their work. So one such idea was brought to the Captain America comic strip, specifically the ricocheting shield thing that the Captain used during combat. After that, Stanley began to rise up and become a full-fledged author. He actively wrote stories in the genre of romance, mysticism, and horror. Because of this, he was promoted to editor at only 18 years old. We can say that, since then, luck hasn't left our hero. He still dreamed of becoming a great novelist and decided to change his name. His name is now Stan Lee. And from now on, we'll call him by that name and no other. Stan was afraid that other publishers would not publish his work if they knew he was a comic book writer. If anything, in those days, comics were not held in high esteem, and because of their poor quality, only children could read them. Teenagers didn't do it anymore. Stan had no experience, but had a talent for writing comics, so he continued to work in this field. until World War II broke out, so Stan volunteered at the front. There, he repaired communications equipment and telegraph poles, but he had made a mistake and was reassigned. He began writing manuals, slogans, educational films. The war was over. In 1947, Stan returned to Timely and was promoted to editor-in-chief of comics. And a little later, he found his true love. Her name was Joan, and they had 2 children, also Joan and Jan. Unfortunately, their second daughter died on the 3rd day after birth. That's when Stan rushed off to work, and just in time. Timely was gone. The publisher was now Atlas, and they didn't get much work done because the respect for comics was decreasing. In 1954, all the parents hated this art form. They complained that comics were full of violence and that it had a devastating effect on children. The story is reminiscent of video games at their dawn, except we know what it led to, don't we? To the failure. There was a book that almost killed the whole industry. It was called Seduction of the Innocent and was written by the child psychologist Frederick Wertham. The book linked the rise in child abuse to reading comic books. After it, the government even considered outlawing comic books. As a result, comics were simply not sold. Many companies shut down, and the remaining ones banded together to form Comics Code Authority, which published comics that were guaranteed to be non-violent. 6 years went by. Atlas was still in business, but it had changed a lot. Lee himself had worked there for 20 years and was already thinking about leaving. He missed the old atmosphere, the culture he used to have in his surroundings. But things didn't go according to plan. So Stan goes to the director, says he wants to quit, and the director says to him, "What? Really? Where are you going?" "Here's your new assignment." No, it wasn't like that. Stan couldn't say a word to Martin. Martin said right from the doorstep that Lee had a new challenge, which was to create the kind of superheroes that could compete with DC's Justice League. Stan Lee was thrilled with such an idea, really, though he still wanted out. Little of what he wrote for the publisher was released. In the future, he would compare his feelings to those of a small-town DJ and share that he felt like he was wasting his talent. He didn't know what he could do. For this, he turned to his wife and asked her for advice. From her, he heard the following: "You're going anyway. What difference does it make whatever you write now? Do it." And Stan heeded this advice. In his mind, Stan quickly came to the conclusion that it was time to bring something truly literary to comics. Create normal characters. The mind quickly realized such a request. To bring the idea to fruition, he turned to fellow artist and comic book writer Jack Kirby. The Fantastic Four had already been their creation, the brave guys who saved the world. Brave? No, they just had superpowers and didn't stand out for anything else. They weren't perfectly handsome. They had the usual human weaknesses and flaws. They were alive. Yes, alive. Stan was able to bring something to comics that no one had dared to do before, to make the characters real. A year later, the first Fantastic Four comic book came out. Stan was overwhelmed by the popularity of his work. It became a sales hit. It sold better than any of Atlas's previous works. Also, it wasn't just kids who were starting to read this comic book, because the Fantastic Four turned out to be the first superheroes in which older people recognized themselves. After that, Stan began to feel more confident. That's when the idea for the comic book The Incredible Hulk was born. Stan was inspired by the strange story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, creating an unsightly scientist who became a monster with almost limitless power if he lost his temper or panicked. and possessed a living destiny because those he defended rejected him because of his power. The Hulk was persecuted by his friends. By the way, in comics, characters were made special by human traits. Stan tried to humanize his characters as much as possible. On the contrary, once, Marvel lawyers proved in court that their characters were not human. All that is due to the strange tax on the import of humanoid dolls. The trade of branded toys would have been less profitable. Stan noticed how much comics were beginning to change, including with his help, and he managed to convince Martin to change the company name to Marvel. Okay, Stan showed incredible career progression. He was promoted to editor-in-chief and could ask the artist to draw whatever he wanted. However, he was still trying to convince Martin that his ideas were good. He didn't give up trying, even when Martin spit on the Spider-Man concept, saying it was the worst idea he had ever heard. Why? A teenager being bitten by a radioactive spider and gaining superpowers afterwards? Nah, that's a shitty idea. Because teenagers don't happen to be the main characters in comic books, and people hate spiders. Yeah, that's about what Martin said. But Stan didn't give a damn what Martin said. He secretly asked artist Steve Ditko to create such a superhero and then put a story about him in a comic book that had already been discontinued. A final edition was in the making. Stan Lee was not a stupid man. He knew that either they would pay off now or the idea that was exciting him so much would be forgotten. It was the Amazing Fantasy series. So thanks to the Spider story, this comic book was such a hit that it turned out to be the top bestseller of the decade. When Martin found out about it, he immediately ran up to Stan and said something like, "Remember when you came up with that great Spider-Man idea? Let's do a series." After seeing such results, Martin no longer crossed Stan and gave the go-ahead to all his ideas, including some questionable superheroes. Which ones? Well, for example, Thor, Doctor Strange, and Ant-Man. Not only were all these superheroes alive as characters, but they were also the embodiment of civil rights movements that tried to abolish violence and bullying. When Martin saw that the company was a real success, he decided to resign and sell the company. A buyer was quickly found. It was some Martin Ackerman who bought the company for $15 million, but under the condition that Lee would still be the creative head of the company. Stan agreed to this and was promoted. Once Stan got such a position, he wondered what else he could do with the company. Eventually, the idea of a comic book movie came to him, and he got the green light. That's how the first Hulk movie came about. Lee dreamed of seeing not just a TV series, but a real Hollywood blockbuster about Marvel superheroes. But no one agreed to it. They said the realization would be difficult. And then, the Superman movie came along, and Stan realized his ideas would finally get the go-ahead. He moved with his family to Los Angeles and started meeting with producers to bring the idea to fruition. The euphoria was short-lived. Not only did the project never come to life, but the company's new owner, Ron Perlman, nearly bankrupted it to the brink by buying up several third-party companies and raising the price of comics. Because of this, the company was no longer owned by both Lee and even Ron. Banks, subsidiaries, and third-party stockholders fought over the company. Eventually, Toy Biz's Offer subsidiary took over management. Subsequently, Avi Arad, co-founder of the aforementioned company, became CEO of Marvel. But a year and a half later, he left the post and let Peter Cuneo take his place. Peter was already able to revive the company. Avi was the creative director of Marvel. He wanted to realize the potential of Marvel Studios in the film world. Because the previous owners were making unprofitable contracts with movie studios and getting almost nothing from them. The company had a man named David Mizell who offered to open his own studio, and in 2005, using the character patents as collateral, they got a non-recourse loan from Merrill Lynch. By that time, Stan Lee was no longer with the company, but he continued to actively cooperate with it, helping and giving advice. And the movies were so successful that Disney decided to buy out Marvel. Stan Lee saw this success, but sadly left our world in 2018 at the age of 95. It's amazing how inspiring this story can be. A man from a poor family with little or no connections, but with a remarkable talent, turned an entire franchise upside down, giving it real depth, sincerity, and life.